Marcus Sullivan was 42 years old when he found the trap door under the ice. He had been living alone for almost 6 years in a cabin in the Alaskan backcountry, about 50 kilometers from the nearest town, a small community called Healy. The cabin was simple, built of dark, sturdy wood with a stone chimney that constantly smoked during the harsh winter. Marcus woke up every day before dawn, brewed strong black coffee, put on his thermal clothing, and went out to chop firewood or check the traps he had spread throughout the forest. He hunted hares, moose when he was lucky, and occasionally fished in the frozen river that cut through the valley below his property. His routine was methodical, almost robotic, as if every movement had been rehearsed 1,000 times. He avoided going to town unless it was absolutely necessary. When he did, he bought basic supplies in silence, ignored the curious glances of the locals, and returned to his isolation as quickly as possible. People knew who he was, an ex-military man, a veteran of the wars in the Middle East, but no one asked for details, and Marcus offered no explanations. He had a long, grizzled beard, deep wrinkles around his eyes, and a permanent expression of exhaustion. His hands were calloused, his movements precise, but there was something in his gaze that revealed a silent, ancient pain. The nights were the worst. Marcus would drink cheap whiskey alone, sitting in his rocking chair in front of the fireplace, watching the flames dance as uninvited memories invaded his mind. He tried to push them away, tried to focus on the crackling of the fire, the howling of the wind outside, but they always came back. Faces of young men, sounds of explosions, screams in languages he didn't understand, the smell of blood and gunpowder. Marcus had served 17 years in the Marine Corps, most of that time in force reconnaissance, the elite units specializing in deep intelligence operations in enemy territory. He had seen combat in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in places whose names he could never reveal. He had killed men, had seen friends die, had done things that haunted him every night. When he finally left the military at 36, he returned to the United States a stranger in his own land. His wife, Jennifer, had tried to help him. She really had tried, but Marcus could no longer connect with her, couldn't explain what was happening inside his head, couldn't sleep next to her without having violent nightmares that made him wake up screaming and sweating. Jennifer had patience, she had love, but she also had her limits. After 2 years of trying to save a marriage that was already dead, she asked for a divorce. Marcus signed the papers without protest. He knew she deserved better, deserved someone whole, someone who wasn't broken inside. After the divorce, Marcus wandered aimlessly for a few months, working odd jobs, drinking too much, sleeping in cheap motels. It was then that he saw the ad for the cabin in Alaska. An old Vietnam veteran was selling the property for a ridiculously low price. The place was isolated, rustic, with no modern luxuries. It was perfect. Marcus bought the cabin with his savings and moved there without looking back. For the first few months, he convinced himself he was just seeking peace and quiet, a place to recover. But as the months turned into years, he realized the truth. He wasn't recovering. He was hiding. He was punishing himself through isolation, denying himself any human connection, any chance of happiness. He deserved this self-imposed exile, or at least that's what he told himself every night as he drank alone. It was on a particularly cold February morning that everything changed. Marcus had gone out for a walk in the forest, something he did regularly to maintain his sanity. The snow was deep, above his knees in some places, and the sky was gray and heavy, promising more snow. He was following a trail he knew well, a circular route that took him through a dense grove of firs and pines, then along a rocky ridge overlooking the valley, and finally back to the cabin. It was about a 3-hour hike when the snow was deep. Marcus liked these moments of physical exertion. They kept his mind busy, focused on the present, on the next step, the next breath, instead of sinking into memories of the past. He was about an hour and a half into the hike when his right foot stumbled on something solid hidden beneath the layer of packed snow. At first he thought it was just a rock or a fallen log, but something about it felt different, artificial. The shape was too regular, too angular. Marcus stopped, looked around, and then started digging with his gloved hands. The snow was hard as concrete, compacted by weeks of intense cold and constant wind. He dug for almost an hour, his hands starting to ache even through the thick gloves, until he finally revealed something metallic. It was a trapdoor, made of heavy steel, covered in rust and decades of ice buildup. It was about 1.5 meters in diameter with an iron handle in the center. There was also some kind of military insignia etched into the metal, almost completely erased by time and oxidation, but still vaguely visible. Marcus stood there, staring at the object as if it were an apparition. His heart began to beat faster. He knew this type of structure. He had seen similar things in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in abandoned military bases. It was an underground shelter, probably from the Cold War era when the U.S. government built hundreds of these bunkers across the country, secret observation posts scattered in remote locations to monitor potential Soviet attacks. Marcus tried to open the trapdoor right then and there, grabbing the iron handle with both hands and pulling with all his might, but it was locked tight by ice and rust. The structure didn't move an inch. He tried again, adjusting his position, planting his feet firmly in the snow and using his body weight, but it was useless. The trapdoor was sealed as if it were part of the earth itself. Marcus mentally marked the spot, observing the surrounding trees, noting a particularly tall and gnarled sequoia about 10 meters to the north and a cluster of gray rocks to the east. He took out his handheld GPS and saved the coordinates. Then, with one last look at the trapdoor, he headed back to the cabin with a strange feeling in his chest, a mixture of curiosity and unease that he couldn't fully explain. Why did it bother him so much? Why did he feel compelled to open it? There were thousands of abandoned bunkers scattered across the country. It meant nothing. But still, as he walked back, Marcus couldn't get that image out of his head. The rusted metal trapdoor, hidden under decades of snow and oblivion, silently waiting for someone to find it. That night, Marcus could barely sleep. He lay in his narrow bed, covered by heavy blankets, staring at the dark wooden ceiling, thinking about the trapdoor. He tried to convince himself it was just foolish curiosity, that it didn't matter, that he should forget about it. But the more he tried to push the thought away, the more it persisted. Around 3 a.m, he finally gave up on sleeping, got up, lit a kerosene lamp, and began to prepare his equipment. If he was going to do this, he was going to do it right. Marcus was a professional, trained for reconnaissance missions in hostile environments, and even after all these years, his planning instincts were still sharp. He packed an assault pack with everything he might need. He included 50 meters of high-strength military climbing rope, 3 powerful LED flashlights with extra batteries, a full first aid kit, emergency flares, waterproof matches, a combat knife, a small axe, a folding saw, a crowbar he had in the shed, water and thermal bottles to prevent freezing, high-calorie energy bars, freeze-dried military rations, a portable emergency radio, his fully charged cell phone even though he knew he probably wouldn't have a signal, an emergency thermal blanket, one of those silver ones that reflect body heat, extra dry clothes in waterproof bags, extra gloves, and a small folding shovel. He checked each item twice, ensuring everything was functional and accessible. It was too much gear for a simple exploration, but old habits died hard, and Marcus always preferred to be overprepared rather than underprepared. When the sun finally rose, bringing with it a pale, cold light that barely penetrated the dense clouds, Marcus was already dressed in his best thermal gear and ready to go. He drank a quick coffee, ate some fried eggs with bacon, and then grabbed his pack and left the cabin. The walk to the trapdoor took just over an hour this time, as he knew the exact way. When he arrived at the spot, he stood for a moment, observing the trapdoor partially exposed in the snow. The daylight made it less mysterious, but somehow more real, more threatening. Marcus took the pack off his back, grabbed the folding shovel, and began to dig around the trapdoor, removing all the snow until he had completely exposed the structure and the frozen ground around it. It took over an hour. When he finished, he was sweating inside his thermal clothes, despite the intense cold. He took the crowbar, positioned it under the edge of the trapdoor, and began to pry, using the principle of leverage to multiply his force. The metal groaned and creaked but didn't move. Marcus adjusted his position and tried again. This time, he heard a distinct crack, the sound of breaking ice. He kept prying, sweat running down his face, muscles burning with the effort. Finally, with a loud metallic shriek, the trapdoor moved a few centimeters. Encouraged, Marcus repositioned the crowbar and pulled with everything he had. The trapdoor suddenly swung open, rotating on rusty hinges with a horrible screech that echoed through the silent forest. A cold, stale air rose from the dark hole like the breath of an ancient tomb, carrying with it a smell of mold, rusted metal, and something else, something indefinable that made Marcus instinctively recoil. He took out one of his powerful flashlights and shone it into the entrance. The light revealed a vertical iron ladder descending straight down, disappearing into the darkness after about 15 or 20 meters. The ladder was covered in red and brown rust, and some of the rungs looked dangerously corroded. The walls around the ladder were thick concrete, damp and stained by decades of water seepage. Marcus stood there for long minutes, kneeling at the edge of the hole, looking into that abyss, feeling the cold wind on his face. There was no logical reason to go down there. It was dangerous, potentially deadly. The structure was decades old. The ladder could collapse at any moment. There could be toxic gases below or accumulated water, or any number of hazards. The sensible thing to do would be to report the discovery to the authorities and let them handle it. But Marcus hadn't done the sensible thing in a long time, and there was something in that hole that called to him, something he couldn't explain or resist. It was as if the abyss was looking back at him, recognizing something in him, something broken and lost that belonged down there in the darkness. Marcus checked his pack one last time, making sure everything was secure. Then he tied one end of the climbing rope firmly around a thick nearby tree, tested the knot 3 times to ensure it was secure, and let the other end drop down the hole as an extra safety line. He clipped his best flashlight to his belt, adjusted the pack on his back, and began to descend. The descent was slow, methodical, and terrifying. Each iron rung groaned and creaked under Marcus's weight, and he could feel the rust flaking off under his gloved hands. He tested each step before putting his full weight on it, moving with extreme caution. The beam of his flashlight illuminated only a few meters ahead, and below him was only a darkness that seemed to swallow the light. The concrete walls were damp and covered in a greenish layer of mold and leached minerals. With every meter he descended, the air grew colder and staler, with that strange smell of a place sealed for decades. Marcus could hear his own breathing echoing, amplified by the narrow walls of the shaft. His heart pounded in his chest, not exactly from fear, but from an intense anticipation he hadn't felt in years. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 5 minutes, his feet finally touched solid ground. Marcus stood still for a moment, letting his eyes adjust, though there was no light other than his own flashlight. He slowly scanned his surroundings, and what he saw left him completely breathless. It was a bunker, just as he had imagined, but much larger and better preserved than he had expected. The main space was about 10 meters long by 5 wide, with a low ceiling just over 2 meters high, supported by I-beam metal girders painted a faded military green. The walls were thick concrete, at least half a meter thick, judging by the depth of the entrance, designed to withstand nuclear blasts or airstrikes. There were rusted metal shelves along both side walls, filled with green military crates, equipment covered in dust and cobwebs, old radios with analog dials and broken antennas, folded and yellowed maps, technical manuals with faded covers, military rations in vintage packaging that Marcus recognized as being from the 1980s, cans of emergency water, medical kits in metal boxes with painted red crosses, gas masks hanging from hooks on the wall, and piles of obsolete electronic equipment that was probably state-of-the-art during the Cold War. In the left corner of the bunker, there was a small area that had clearly served as a workstation. A military metal desk, one of those foldable, indestructible types, was positioned against the wall with 2 metal chairs. On the desk, covered by a thin layer of dust that seemed decades old, were several personal items that made Marcus stop and look more closely. There was an aluminum military coffee mug, still with dark, moldy residue at the bottom, a metal ashtray full of old, decomposed cigarette butts, a few pens and pencils in a metal cup, a pair of reading glasses with dust-covered lenses, several stacks of papers and documents, and most notably, a worn leather-bound journal, the kind used by soldiers for field logs. There was also a photograph in a small metal frame showing a smiling young woman with 2 small children. The photo was faded but still recognizable, frozen in time like everything else in this forgotten place. Marcus walked slowly through the bunker, his flashlight illuminating every detail. The walls were covered with Cold War military maps, pinned up with rusty thumbtacks and yellowed tape that disintegrated at the touch. The maps showed routes of Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles, strategic bases marked with military symbols Marcus recognized from his own training, observation points, attack vectors, nuclear impact zones, all meticulously marked and annotated. There were also photographs tacked to the walls, black and white photos of young soldiers in American military uniforms from the 1980s, with those characteristic haircuts of the era and serious expressions as they looked directly at the camera. Marcus examined the photos more closely, shining his light on each face, searching for something without knowing exactly what. And then he saw it. In one of the photos, a group of 6 men in combat uniforms posed in front of a helicopter. They looked young, most of them probably in their early 20s. With that mixture of confidence and nervousness, Marcus recognized in all young soldiers. But it was the man in the center of the group that made Marcus freeze. Even through the dust and fading of the photograph, even after all these years, he recognized that face instantly. It was Sergeant Jonathan Hayes, the man who had been his mentor, his superior, his inspiration during Marcus's first years in the Marine Corps. Marcus picked up the journal from the desk with slightly trembling hands. The leather cover was stiff and stained, but when he carefully opened it, the inner pages were surprisingly well preserved. The pages were made of that sturdy paper used in military notebooks, yellowed with time but still completely legible. The first page had an official United States Marine Corps label with a space for name, rank, and unit. The name written in careful letters was Sergeant Jonathan R. Hayes. The unit was 1st Force Reconnaissance Company. The start date was March 15, 1983. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. Hayes had been here. Hayes had lived in this hole in the ground, alone, watching and waiting for a war that thankfully never came. Marcus turned the pages slowly, with reverence, as if he were holding a sacred artifact. The first entries were formal and procedural, exactly what you would expect from a military report. Hayes recorded daily weather conditions, equipment check results, communication times with higher command, bunker status reports. The handwriting was steady, clear, and professional. But as Marcus continued to read, turning page after page, the tone began to subtly change. The entries became longer, more personal, less formal. Hayes began to write about his experiences, his thoughts, his emotions. He wrote about the overwhelming loneliness of being alone in that bunker for weeks on end. He wrote about the silence that seemed to have a physical weight, pressing against his ears until he started to hear phantom ringing. He wrote about disturbing dreams where he was buried alive, or where nuclear attack sirens blared but he couldn't move. He wrote about longing, a deep, painful longing for his wife Carol and his 2 young children, Tommy and Sarah, whose photos he kept by his narrow cot. Marcus read a particularly moving entry dated July 23, 1983. Hayes wrote about his son Tommy's 4th birthday, an event he was missing because he was stuck in that hole serving his country. He described in painful detail how he had planned to take Tommy fishing that day, how he had promised to teach the boy how to cast a fishing rod properly. He wrote about the quick, static-filled phone call he had managed to make home that day, just 5 precious minutes where he heard his son's voice singing happy birthday to himself, the small voice distorted by the bad line but still recognizable. Hayes wrote about how he had to hang up the phone and sit alone in the cold bunker, crying silently because he couldn't let anyone hear him, maintaining that facade of military toughness even when no one was around to witness it. Marcus had to stop reading for a moment, putting the journal back on the desk and turning away. His own throat was tight with emotion. He knew that feeling. He knew that specific, corrosive loneliness that comes from serving in forgotten places, making sacrifices no one would ever know or appreciate. He remembered his own phone calls home from Afghanistan, those short, unsatisfying conversations with Jennifer where he couldn't say where he was or what he was doing, where he tried to pretend everything was fine, when in fact he was terrified and exhausted. He remembered missing her birthday, Christmas, New Year's, wedding anniversaries, all sacrificed on the altar of duty and mission. Marcus forced himself to keep reading. Hayes's entries continued for months, documenting the slow psychological degradation of an isolated man. He wrote about starting to talk to himself just to hear a human voice. He wrote about developing small, obsessive routines just to maintain some structure and sanity, like organizing his supplies in alphabetical order every day, or doing push-ups in precise sets of 50. He wrote about growing paranoia, about starting to hear sounds that weren't there, about compulsively checking and rechecking the communication systems, afraid of missing a crucial warning signal. But Hayes also wrote about moments of surprising clarity and deep introspection. He questioned the purpose of his mission, questioned whether he was really making a difference, or if he was just a disposable piece in a larger geopolitical game he didn't fully understand. He wrote about the absurdity of sitting alone in a hole in Alaska, waiting for nuclear missiles that may or may not be coming, prepared to report an attack that, if it happened, would likely mean the end of everything he knew and loved. What was the point? What was he really protecting? These questions clearly tormented him. And then Marcus reached the last entries of the journal, and his heart began to beat harder. The dates jumped. After an entry from November 5th, 1983, the next entry was from December 23rd of the same year. Hayes wrote that he had been temporarily replaced, that he had managed to get leave to go home for Christmas with his family. He described the incredible relief of getting out of that bunker, of seeing the open sky again, of hugging his wife and children. But he also wrote about the strange guilt he felt for being happy to leave his post, as if he were abandoning something important. The last entry in the journal was from January 2nd, 1984, when Hayes returned to the bunker for another tour. He wrote that he was determined to be stronger this time, not to let the isolation affect him so much. And then the journal simply stopped. There were no more entries after that date. Marcus sat in silence in the metal chair, holding the closed journal in his hands, trying to process everything he had read. What had happened to Hayes after that last entry? He knew that Hayes had continued in the military, eventually being promoted and transferred to other units, eventually serving in Iraq where he died heroically in 2004. But what had these months in this bunker done to him? How had they changed him? Marcus looked around the bunker again, seeing it now with new eyes. This wasn't just a Cold War relic. It was a testament to human sacrifice, to men like Hayes who gave parts of themselves, parts of their minds and souls, serving in forgotten places for reasons that often seemed absurd in retrospect. And Marcus began to see disturbing parallels with his own life. Hadn't he also isolated himself? Hadn't he buried himself in his own kind of bunker, not physically, but emotionally, cutting himself off from all human connections, punishing himself for the past? The only difference was that Hayes had been ordered to be in that bunker. Marcus had chosen his own isolation voluntarily. Memories began to invade his mind with devastating force. Memories he had locked away and buried deep, but which now exploded through the barriers he had built. He remembered his own time in Afghanistan, the deep reconnaissance missions in hostile territory where his team operated completely alone for days or weeks, without support, depending only on each other. He remembered the faces of his platoon mates. Corporal James Morrison, 23, from Georgia, always making bad jokes to keep morale up. Private First Class David Chen, 25, from California, a communications specialist who could fix any broken radio. Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, 28, from Texas, a sniper with an unerring eye. Corporal Tyler Washington, 22, from Michigan, the youngest on the team, always smiling despite the constant danger. And then Marcus forced himself to remember that night, that specific mission that had destroyed him from the inside, and that he had spent 6 years trying to forget. It was September 2010, Helmand Province, Afghanistan. Marcus's team, 8 men including himself, had been ordered to reconnoiter a remote village called Karwar that intelligence suggested was being used as a base of operations by a high-level Taliban commander. The intel was fragmented, coming from multiple sources that weren't entirely reliable. But there was pressure from above, pressure for results, pressure for action. Marcus led his team through treacherous mountainous terrain at night, using night vision goggles to navigate. They moved in total silence, communicating only through hand signals, green ghosts in the dark. It took 6 hours to reach the village. When they finally reached an observation point on a ridge above Karwar, Marcus established surveillance. Through his binoculars, he watched the sleeping village below. There were perhaps 20 or 30 mud brick structures, some sheep in pens, irrigated fields. It looked peaceful, normal, but Marcus knew that appearances could be deceiving. He watched for an hour, looking for signs of hostile activity, for weapons, for suspicious movements. He saw nothing conclusive, but he also saw nothing that definitively ruled out the presence of insurgents. And that's when Marcus made the mistake that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He had a gut feeling, a visceral sense that something was wrong. An intuition developed through years of combat that told him to pull back, to spend more time on reconnaissance, not to act rashly. But he ignored that instinct. He ignored it because he was tired, because he wanted to finish the mission, because there was pressure from his superiors for results, Because a part of him was numb and didn't want to overthink it, he made the decision to move in, to enter the village to confirm or deny the presence of the Taliban commander. Marcus gave the order, and his team began to descend from the ridge in tactical formation. They entered the village from the north end, moving between the mud brick structures in absolute silence. Everything seemed quiet. Too quiet, Marcus thought later. But at the moment, he just kept going. They reached the center of the village, a small square with a water well. And that's when the world exploded. The first IED, an improvised explosive device buried in the street, detonated directly under Corporal Morrison. The explosion was deafening, an orange fireball that lit up the night. Morrison disappeared instantly, vaporized. Before anyone could react, a second explosion came from the other side, killing Private Chen. And then automatic weapons fire started coming from all sides. From rooftops, from windows, from positions they hadn't detected. The entire village was an elaborate trap. Marcus screamed orders. His team tried to scatter for cover, but they were completely exposed in the center of the square. Sergeant Rodriguez was hit in the neck by a rifle round, falling to the ground and bleeding profusely. Corporal Washington was hit in the chest and leg. Marcus and the 3 remaining men managed to drag themselves to the cover of a mud wall, pulling the wounded with them. The next few minutes were pure chaos. Marcus called for urgent support on the radio while his team returned fire desperately against enemies they could barely see. Rodriguez bled out in his arms as Marcus tried to apply pressure to the neck wound, the warm blood soaking his hands. Washington was unconscious and pale, losing blood rapidly from his wounds. Marcus made the decision to retreat immediately, even under heavy fire. They couldn't win this fight. They carried Washington and began to move out of the village, providing cover for each other, throwing smoke grenades to obscure their movements. It was then that Private First Class Anderson, one of the 3 men still able to fight, was hit in the head by a sniper's bullet. He fell dead instantly. Marcus and the 2 remaining men, both wounded but still functional, finally managed to get out of the kill zone with Washington. They crawled up the hill under continuous fire, each meter an eternity. It took 40 minutes that felt like hours to reach a defensible position where they could establish a perimeter and wait for extraction. Washington died while they waited, his wounds too severe, his small young body simply giving up despite Marcus's desperate efforts to keep him alive with the medical kit. When the rescue helicopter finally arrived 2 hours later, 4 of Marcus's 8 men were dead. Morrison vaporized by the IED, Chen killed by the second explosive. Rodriguez bled to death, Anderson killed by a gunshot to the head, Washington dead from multiple wounds during extraction. Of the 3 survivors besides Marcus, 2 were permanently disabled by their injuries. Marcus was the only one who walked away physically unscathed, but emotionally, psychologically, he was destroyed. The subsequent military investigation was meticulous and brutal. Marcus was questioned repeatedly, his movements analyzed, his decisions scrutinized. Why had he moved in when the signs indicated danger? Why hadn't he waited for reinforcements or air support? Why had he put his team in such a vulnerable position? The questions were valid, and Marcus had no good answers. He had made mistakes that had cost 4 lives. The investigation eventually concluded that while Marcus's decisions could be questioned, he hadn't directly violated any orders or protocols. The mission was inherently high risk, and losses were a recognized possibility. Marcus was not formally blamed or punished, but it didn't matter. He knew the truth. He had killed his own men through negligence and poor judgment. Sitting there in the cold, dark bunker, Marcus finally allowed himself to feel everything he had suppressed for 6 years. The guilt he carried like a physical weight on his chest. The shame of having survived when better men, younger men with their whole lives ahead of them, had died. The anger at himself for every mistake he had made. The remorse for never having had the courage to face the families of those men, to look into the eyes of the mothers and fathers and wives and say that he was responsible. Marcus began to cry there in the freezing bunker, tears streaming down his bearded face. He hadn't cried in years, maybe not since the funerals of his men. He had built walls around his emotions, walls of isolation and alcohol and brutal physical labor, had convinced himself that crying was weakness, that he needed to be strong, that he just needed to move on and forget. But there, alone in the darkness of that forgotten hole, surrounded by the ghosts of another man who had suffered his own form of silent torment, the walls began to crumble. Marcus started to speak aloud for the first time in years about that night. about his decisions, about his guilt. He spoke to Hayes as if the man could hear him across time and space. He spoke to Morrison and Chen and Rodriguez and Anderson and Washington, asking for a forgiveness he knew would never come. He spoke to himself, finally confronting the truths he had avoided for so long. His voice echoed off the concrete walls, initially weak and broken, then stronger, more desperate. He screamed out his pain. He punched the metal desk repeatedly until his hands ached. He kicked one of the chairs, which fell with a crash. He unleashed years of repressed torment in a violent and necessary catharsis. And then, exhausted, he just sat there in the silence, hearing only the distant sound of the wind outside filtering through the bunker's entrance, and his own heavy, ragged breathing. He stayed there for hours, lost in thoughts and memories, with no sense of how much time was passing. It was only when Marcus began to feel truly cold that he finally looked at his watch. It was almost 6 in the evening. He had been in the bunker for over 8 hours. The sun would be setting outside, and the temperature would drop drastically as it always did on Alaskan winter nights. Marcus stood up slowly, his joints stiff from sitting for so long. He needed to get out of there. He needed to get back to the cabin. He grabbed his pack, checked his flashlight, and walked to the base of the ladder. He pointed the light upward, and his heart sank. The trap door, which he had left partially open when he descended, was now clearly visible, but something was wrong. He could see that the opening was different, smaller somehow. Marcus began to climb the ladder cautiously, testing each rusty rung before putting his weight on it. When he got near the top, he understood the problem. The temperature outside had dropped drastically while he was inside the bunker, and the moisture in the air had frozen. The trap door, which had been partially open, was now completely covered by a thick layer of new ice that had formed in the last few hours. Worse, the iron ladder itself was coated in a layer of clear ice, smooth as glass. Marcus tried to push the trap door with one hand while holding on with the other, but it wouldn't budge an inch. It was completely frozen shut. He tried again, this time using both hands and his full body weight, but it was useless. The ice was too thick, and his position on the ladder didn't give him enough leverage. Marcus slowly climbed back down to the bottom of the bunker, his heart beating faster, a sense of panic beginning to form in his chest. He was trapped, completely trapped. Marcus forced himself to breathe deeply and stay calm. He was trained for survival situations. He had faced worse. There was no reason to panic. He just needed to think logically and make a plan. He checked his resources. He had his pack with water and food for maybe 2 days if he rationed it carefully. There were also those old military rations on the bunker shelves. They were decades old, but military rations were designed to last indefinitely if stored properly. He could risk eating them if necessary. The bigger problem was the cold. The temperature inside the bunker was dropping, and he could see his breath forming clouds of vapor. He had good thermal clothing, but not enough to stay comfortable there for long. Marcus explored the bunker more thoroughly now, looking for anything useful. He found some old military blankets folded on a high shelf. They were stiff and moldy and smelled horrible, but they were still blankets. He also found a small portable kerosene heater in a corner, but when he tried to light it, he discovered the fuel had completely evaporated decades ago. He found more tools, including a small pickaxe and another, heavier crowbar than the one he had brought. These would be useful. He knew what he had to do. He needed to break the ice off the ladder and force the trapdoor again. But he had to be smart about it. He needed to conserve energy and body heat. Working in the extreme cold would burn calories quickly, and he had limited supplies. Marcus decided the best plan was to wait until morning. During the day, even in the Alaskan winter, the sun would likely melt at least some of the ice up there, making the work easier. Wasting energy trying to force his way out at night would be pointless. He set up a sort of camp in the bunker. He spread the old blankets on the concrete floor to insulate against the cold. He arranged his food and water within easy reach. He checked his cell phone, but as expected, he had absolutely no signal down there. He tried the emergency radio but couldn't make contact on any frequency. He was completely cut off. No one knew where he was. No one would come looking for him. If he couldn't get out on his own, he would die in this hole, and no one would ever find his body. The thought was terrifying and at the same time strangely familiar. Wasn't this exactly how he had been living anyway? Isolated, hidden, basically dead to the world. Marcus wrapped himself in the old smelly blankets and tried to sleep, but sleep didn't come easily. The bunker was completely dark without his flashlights. a darkness so absolute he couldn't see his own hand in front of his face. The silence was broken only occasionally by strange sounds, creaks from the metal expanding and contracting with temperature changes, distant drips of water, and sometimes what sounded like the wind whispering through the structure. Though that was impossible, Marcus lay there for hours, his mind racing. He thought of Jennifer, his ex-wife. She had loved him so much, had tried so desperately to save him from himself, but he had pushed her away. He remembered the last time he saw her, when he signed the divorce papers. She had cried, not from sadness at the end of the marriage, but from frustration at not being able to reach him, at not being able to break through the walls he had built. She had said that the Marcus she knew and loved had died in Afghanistan, and that a stranger had come back in his place. At the time, he had been angry, but now, years later, he could see she was right. He had left a fundamental part of himself in that village, on that bloody night. He thought of the parents of Morrison, Chen, Rodriguez, Anderson, and Washington. He had never contacted any of them. He had gone to the funerals, stood in the back, wearing his dress uniform, but he hadn't spoken to any of the families. He didn't have the courage. What could he say? That he had killed their sons through stupidity and arrogance? That their deaths haunted every waking moment of his life? That he wished it had been him who died instead of them? None of that would help. None of that would bring those young men back. So he had run, first to alcohol, then to literal isolation in the mountains of Alaska. When Marcus finally fell asleep, his dreams were disturbed and fragmented. He dreamt he was back in Afghanistan, back in that village. But this time, when the first explosion went off, it was he who disappeared in the fire. He dreamt of Hayes sitting at the bunker desk writing in his journal, but when Marcus tried to speak to him, Hayes couldn't hear him. He dreamt of being buried alive, the bunker ceiling collapsing and burying him under tons of concrete and earth. He woke up several times during the night, disoriented and cold, taking a few seconds to remember where he was. The night seemed to last an eternity. When Marcus finally checked his watch and saw it was 6 in the morning, he felt exhausted rather than rested. He ate an energy bar and drank some water, rationing carefully. Then he took the small pickaxe he had found and started climbing the ladder. Working on the ice proved to be brutally difficult. The old pickaxe was heavy and clumsy, and the ice on the ladder was thick and hard as solid rock. Each blow from the pickaxe echoed through the bunker like a gunshot and sent painful vibrations up Marcus's arms. He worked methodically, starting from the bottom and working his way up, chipping away the ice rung by rung. It was exhausting and dangerous work. He had to hold on with one hand while swinging with the other, always aware that one false move could result in a 15-meter fall straight onto the concrete floor. After an hour of work, Marcus had managed to clear maybe 10 rungs. There were at least 30 more to go. He was sweating inside his thermal clothes despite the cold, his breath coming in heavy gasps, and his arms were burning with fatigue. He climbed down to rest, drank more water, and forced himself to eat another energy bar, even though he had no appetite. After a half-hour rest, he went back to work. This pattern continued for the rest of the day. Marcus would work for an hour, rest for half an hour, then work again. It was meditative in a way, the repetitive physical effort occupying his mind and leaving no room to think about his precarious situation or the painful memories that had haunted him since he descended into that hole. As the hours passed, Marcus made steady but painfully slow progress. He managed to clear about half the ladder by nightfall on the second day, but his resources were dwindling. He had eaten all of his own food and was now relying on the old military rations he found on the shelves. He opened one with his combat knife, nervous about what he would find. The contents looked surprisingly normal, just extremely dehydrated and compacted. He risked eating a small portion. The taste was awful, like salted cardboard, but his stomach accepted it without protest. He drank more water, aware that his supply was getting worryingly low. He had maybe enough water for one more day, 2 at most. After that, he would be in serious trouble. That second night, Marcus again tried to sleep, but found it even more difficult. His body ached all over from the extreme physical exertion. His hands were raw and bleeding, the skin on his palms torn and chafed despite the gloves. His muscles were so tense that every movement was painful. Worse, he was starting to feel the first real signs of hypothermia. Even wrapped in all the available blankets, he was shivering uncontrollably. His fingers and toes were numb, and he was having trouble forming clear thoughts. Marcus knew he was in serious trouble. If he couldn't get out in the next 24 hours, he probably wouldn't get out at all. On the morning of the third day, Marcus woke up feeling worse than ever. He was weak, hungry despite the rations he had eaten, and dangerously dehydrated. His hands were so damaged he could barely make a fist, but he forced himself to get up anyway. Giving up meant dying here, alone and forgotten in this hole in the ground. And somewhere during those terrible days in the bunker, something had changed inside Marcus. He realized he didn't want to die. For the first time in 6 years, he genuinely wanted to live. He wanted to get out of that literal and metaphorical hole. He wanted to try to fix the things he had broken. He wanted to contact the families of those men and finally say what needed to be said. He wanted to call Jennifer and apologize, not expecting her to take him back, but simply because she deserved to hear it. He wanted to seek professional help for his PTSD instead of trying to deal with it alone through isolation. He wanted to live, truly live, not just exist. So Marcus picked up the pickaxe again and went back to work with renewed determination. His blows were weaker now. His body simply didn't have the same strength, but he kept going. Each cleared rung was a small victory. Each piece of broken ice brought him one step closer to freedom. He worked non-stop for hours, ignoring the pain, ignoring the fatigue, focusing only on the next rung, the next blow, the next piece of ice. Finally, in the middle of the afternoon on the third day, Marcus reached the top of the ladder. He had cleared every rung up to the trapdoor. Now came the hardest part. He somehow had to force open the trapdoor, which was still sealed with thick ice. From his precarious position at the top of the ladder, Marcus positioned the heavy crowbar he had found in the bunker. He wedged it between the edge of the trapdoor and the concrete frame, looking for the best point of leverage. Then, holding on with one hand to the top rungs of the ladder, he pulled on the crowbar with everything he had. At first, nothing happened. The trapdoor was solidly stuck. Marcus adjusted his position, found a new foothold, and tried again. This time he heard a distinct crack, the sound of the ice beginning to fracture. Encouraged, he kept pulling. The crowbar suddenly slipped, and Marcus almost lost his balance, his heart leaping into his throat as he clung desperately to the ladder to keep from falling. He waited a moment until his breathing calmed, then repositioned the crowbar and tried a third time. He pulled with every ounce of strength left in his broken and exhausted body. His muscles screamed in protest. His wounded hands bled through his gloves, but he didn't stop. And then, with a loud, gratifying shriek, the trapdoor moved a few centimeters. Sunlight filtered through the opening, momentarily blinding Marcus. He blinked several times, his eyes unaccustomed to the brightness after days in the bunker's gloom. He kept prying, now using both the crowbar and his own body weight. The ice around the trapdoor cracked and broke, pieces falling around him. The trapdoor opened a few more centimeters, then more, and finally, with a final, liberating pop, it swung wide open. Cold, fresh air flooded the bunker. Marcus took a deep breath, filling his lungs with that clean, icy air. He had never felt anything so good. With his last reserves of strength, Marcus climbed the rest of the ladder and emerged onto the surface. He literally crawled out of the hole, collapsing to his knees in the fresh snow. The sunlight was blinding and beautiful. The sky was blue and clear, without a single cloud. The storm had passed, and the world was covered in fresh, pristine snow that glittered like diamonds under the sun. Marcus stayed there on his knees for a long time, just breathing, just being, feeling the sun on his face for the first time in 3 days. He was alive, against all odds, against his own weakness and despair. He had survived. Tears began to roll down his cheeks, but this time they weren't tears of despair or guilt. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of something that could even be called hope. Marcus looked around the forest, seeing it as if for the first time. The trees heavy with snow, the serene silence broken only by the occasional caw of a distant crow, the clean, cold air that burned his lungs but made him feel intensely alive. He stood up slowly, his legs trembling, not just from weakness but from emotion. He looked back at the open trapdoor, that hole in the ground that had almost become his tomb. He thought of Hayes, of his journal, of his silent sacrifices. He thought of his own dead men, of Morrison and Chen and Rodriguez and Anderson and Washington. He thought of Jennifer and all the other people he had pushed away. And for the first time in 6 years, Marcus Sullivan allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to live with his past instead of being destroyed by it. Marcus began the long walk back to the cabin. Every step was difficult, his legs weak and shaky, his body exhausted to the bone. but he kept putting one foot in front of the other. The sun was beginning to set when he finally spotted the smoke from his cabin's chimney on the horizon. He had left the fire going when he left 3 days ago, and apparently it was still burning, fed by the large pile of wood he always kept nearby. It was a beacon guiding him home. When Marcus finally reached the cabin door and stepped inside, the warmth of the interior hit him like a physical wave. He closed the door behind him, took off his pack and outer clothes, and simply sat down in his rocking chair in front of the fireplace. He looked around the small cabin that had been his self-imposed prison for so many years. The dark wooden walls, the narrow bed in the corner, the small table where he ate alone, the shelves with books he never read. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow, he would walk to town. He would go to the one store that sold supplies and use the payphone outside. He would call Jennifer, not knowing what he would say, but knowing he had to say something. He would look for information on how to contact the families of his men. He would research therapists specializing in veteran PTSD. He would begin the long and difficult process of reconnecting with the world, with life, with his humanity. It wouldn't be easy. It would probably be the hardest thing he had ever done, but he had survived the bunker under the ice. He had descended into a literal hell and climbed back out. If he could do that, maybe he could do anything. Marcus Sullivan looked out the window at the snowy forest, at the orange and pink sky of the sunset, and for the first time in 6 long, painful years, he smiled. It was a small, hesitant smile, but it was genuine. It was a beginning. It was hope. It was life.